I'm going to do 2 roll calls. I will do the School Modernization Committee first. Chairman Bates.
Here.
Mr. Bowman. Mr. Gussenberg.
Here.
Ms. Harrigan.
Here.
Mr. Jinks.
Here.
Mr. Martelli.
Here.
Mr. Martinez.
Here.
Mr. Neff.
Here.
Ms. Nichols.
Here.
Ms. O'Donnell. She's here. Mr. Pangaro.
Here.
Here. Mr. Perugini. And Mr. Walsh.
Here.
Okay. We have a quorum, Madam Chair, for the School Modernization Committee. And this is also a joint meeting with council. So I will read roll call for council. Mr. Borrowy.
Present.
Mr. Jinks.
Here.
Ms. Nichols.
Here.
Mr. Orris.
Here.
Where'd you see? Oh, there he is. Okay. Ms. Pavano.
Here.
Mr. Slocum.
Here.
Mr. Talbot. Mr. Veliber.
Here.
Thank you very much.
And Mr. Walsh.
Here.
Okay, Mr. Chairman of Council, you have a quorum of council as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next item, the Pledge of Allegiance. I believe Arnett will put the flag up.
Yep.
Okay. I pledge allegiance
To the flag
of the United
United
States
States of America.
and to the
To the
republic
republic
for which
for
it
which it
stands,
stands,
one nation,
one nation,
under God, indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty and justice
for all.
Okay, thank you. Next item is the approval of the minutes of October 21st. Does anyone have any comments, questions, items about the minutes? Harder to see. It looks like everyone's okay. I'll entertain a motion for approving the minutes.
Move to approve the minutes of October 21st.
Thank you, Rich. Second?
Second,
I didn't see where that came from. I'm sorry.
Jeff Pangaro, second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Just seeing a note here from Anne that her name is misspelled. So Marilyn, if you're listening, if we could have the her name spelled correctly in the minutes, that would be great. Other than that, with that correction, I believe the minutes have passed. Okay. The next item is number 4. Town Council is here joining us today, and thank you all very much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate it. At our last meeting, if you watched it, we also had the Board of Education that came and spoke to us about their educational needs. We wanted to introduce you guys and have you present to talk about your needs and anything that we may need to know from a financial perspective, as far as the process and any other financial budgeting information that you feel that we need to know. So we invited you here to talk about that. I believe there's a someone, maybe Jim, maybe is going to be talking a little bit. Sorry, Mr. Jascott is going to talk a little bit about that. And then after that, if everyone wants to just take a few minutes to say some words, that would be appreciated. If not, that's fine as well. But this is the opportunity to be able to say whatever it is that you feel we need to know to move forward successfully in this project. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Mr. Jascott. Thank you.
So hi, everybody. I'll just start off. I don't know if you recall, but back in January, I attended a meeting and did a presentation a little bit about what rating agencies look at. We've had the luxury of a AAA rating from 2 rating agencies for several years now, and you know, looking forward to maintaining that. One of the things that I had pointed out in that presentation, and I think in the handouts for tonight, we resent the PowerPoint presentation that I did at that meeting. So I don't know if you all have that, but in it there is a a summary of what the rating agencies focus on as far as where they give the points for whether it's the economy, our management, our liquidity, and of course, what is the total amount of our debt service. We have a pretty good fund balance right now. Our fund balance policy is 9.2 to maintain a 9.25% fund balance of our general fund expenditures. My latest projections for this past fiscal year, we're just trying to finish up our audit now, but we're at about 11%. So that's good news. When I did this presentation back in January, I kind of piggybacked off a presentation that our financial advisor prepared for us a few years ago when we were looking at various middle school projects. In that, we had assumed financing, I believe it was a $75 million project, just to give an example of what the debt service would look like. And we had spread that out over 3 bond issues over 3 successive years to bond that on more of a cash flow basis, and just to see what that would look like. And again, that's in some of the charts that were handed out for tonight. I'm just going to kind of do a real brief overview because I did go over this once already back in January, but it is a little bit of a stretch, I think, even going with a $75 million project, but we don't know what the grants are going to be, so depending on what the price tag is here, obviously we would be bonding the net amount. So, I think, where does that stand with regard to how much we're going to have to add on? So I know there was one chart that showed a bar of 10% and what that would look like if we had to borrow these 3 $25 million bond issues. And I don't know if these are paginated, but there will be years that we would exceed that 10% threshold. But I again want to emphasize that debt service isn't the only thing that the rating agencies are going to be looking at. They're going to be looking at the economy. They're going to be looking at our, are we able to maintain our fund balance at a reasonable level? There's a number of factors.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah.
Jim, Tim Slocum.
Sure.
If I could just step in here for one quick second.
Yeah.
When you're talking 10%, you're actually informing us that we've reached a 10% of our budget, our total budget payout would become the debt service line. Is that what you're talking about? Right.
Yeah.
Because I think everyone in the room needs to be reminded or informed that debt service is a piece of our operating budget on a yearly basis. And now it's down at about 6% of the total budget. And it could go as high as 10. That's what you said, based on a $25 million additional load of borrowing.
Yeah. So let me just expand on that a little bit.
Thank you.
Right now, based on, I had not updated these projections for the most recent capital budget, which will ultimately be decided tomorrow night at the referendum on several projects, and then I will update it again. But I don't see anything changing too drastically. And based on what we've borrowed so far and what our capital budget projects, we'll be hitting about 8.5%, and that was one of the charts that I had in tonight's handouts. So that's without doing any schools at all. And I know last time you had asked, well, based on our total general fund budget, how much could we absorb in the way of additional debt if 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 we were to kind of cap it at 10%, which again is I think something that the rating agencies would like to see us stay within that range. And I did some projections on that, and it came out to be if we took the total debt that we pay, really we would only be able to take on an additional approximately 25 million. But I want to remind everyone that we have a water pollution control fund that pays a pretty good chunk of the sewer debt. So if we took that into consideration, we would actually be able to absorb more like 40 million based on the average debt going forward, in addition to what we already have projected in our capital budget. So 40 million, that would be the net number of what we would have to bond. You'd have to, gross that up for any grant money we might be able to get from the state. So, maybe the number's more like 60, 70 million that we could absorb if there was enough state grant funding for a project.
Jim, one more thing. I hate to
Sure.
be parsing,
Yeah.
but when you say can absorb, by that you're really indicating not what taxpayers could absorb, but what the AAA rating could absorb.
Absolutely.
Fine.
Yeah.
I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
That's why I stepped in.
I'm kind of keeping things real general, and I'm throwing out some, big numbers here a little bit because these were some of the numbers that we had been looking at, and I until I have something to zero in on, it's kind of hard to project exactly where this will fall out. But a lot depends too on the growth in our grand list. We've had some pretty good years recently. That could help the situation for sure. I guess I'm kind of really open for any questions because I'm not sure,
Jim, if
How
I
many of you
can, it's
know?
Rob Orris, and thank you all
Sure.
for inviting us tonight. Appreciate the opportunity. Maybe I can just give a little overview as the chair of the council as to my perspective, and I certainly won't suggest I'm speaking for all 9 of us, but I think I've got a pretty good handle on kind of the council's role here, and I want to address some of the questions that the chairwoman asked us, and then maybe get to some of your issues, Jim, as well. Obviously, first and foremost, the SMC is responsible for finding a fiscally responsible plan for the schools. That's your job. That's not our job to do. We don't want to tell you how, where, and when your plan should be. Our plan, I think, is to work with you to implement it in a fiscally responsible manner. And I think that's probably our largest role here. You all know with the schools' assistance what is best for them and the kids. And our role here is to really roll that in some form or fashion that is palatable, not only for the rating agencies, but something that's affordable for all in our community. So those are really our roles here. And I know it's not an easy task to combine them both, particularly with everything we're dealing with in the economy and COVID and everything else these days. So it's a tough environment. But just following up on what Jim suggested, he's looking at one piece of this, which is our debt service. We need to look at this in a larger perspective, in my opinion. We need to make sure we're doing some sensitivity analysis with Jim and his staff. And as I said from the beginning, they are available to you as an SMC committee to do whatever you need to kind of walk this path. It's important that we lay in some kind of pro forma fashion, in my opinion, what we think is going to happen over the next 10 years from a revenue perspective, reimbursements we're getting from the state, what do our expenses look like, what debt service may be coming on in addition to SMC, what may be coming off. There's a whole slew of things that play into this. And certainly we want to make sure that we still can continue to provide the services that we need and the community expects. So all of that kind of needs to be pulled together. And I think Jim's department is really the best one to do that as you start going down some of these paths. And, I know any council member is certainly willing to assist. I'm always available to have conversations, but I think that sensitivity analysis from pro forma work needs to get done once you start honing into kind of what you're thinking. And, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but to kind of put it in perspective, I think $75 million in just a bond float by us. So if we issue a $75 million bond issuance, just in and of itself is about a 2.5 mil increase if nothing else changes. Is that correct, Jim? Just so people can put it in perspective.
Yeah. So,
I know in the sheet you gave us, you said 15 mil was a 0.5 mil increase kind of in year 2. I know the first year is kind of a low number, but it balances out to be about 0.5 mil.
right.
So obviously if you
Yeah,
multiply
so
that
that-
out at 75 mils, it's
Absolutely.
probably a 2.5 mil increase. And that's just looking at it in a vacuum. And I'm not suggesting that that's how we can look at it, but that just gives you kind of a quick litmus test as to, okay, if we go out and issue a $75 million bond, that's what the cost will be to the taxpayer if nothing else changes. Am I wrong in that, Jim?
No, and I'd be happy to run projections, on various scenarios with the effect on what it would be to our taxpayers, and I can certainly, even for the next meeting, give you some idea of what that might look at with various, bond borrowing ranges and what the average would be to a taxpayer over the ensuing 20 years.
Right.
In addition to what our current mill rate is.
I think it's going to be the total story, folks. It's not so much just what it does to debt service as a percentage of our operating budget. Jim, correct me if I'm wrong. So when we throw out 45 million or $40 million, and maybe that's the best you could do, I don't know that I would hang my hat on that. I think we should have more latitude depending on what the overall picture looks like. That's what
Absolutely.
I'm suggesting. And so I wouldn't get caught on that number.
Right. Yeah, I want to stress that as well, because, from a rating perspective, that's certainly not the only thing that they focus in on. It's not just what our debt service level is. It's the economy. It's our management. It's, how well are we able to stay within our budget parameters year over year? So we've got a good reputation out there with the rating agencies right now, and I think that'll certainly help. Another thing I just want to throw out is when we've done these projections historically, we've used conservative interest rate projections. I think a lot of the work I do is based on 4%. The 75 million that was done here was based on a range of 3.25 and 3.5. But the interest rates right now are a lot lower than that. They're probably more in the 2% range. So that could make a big difference too if we're so fortunate to bond in an environment where the interest rates are low.
Thanks, Jim. And just to final my comments, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the council. Kind of, I'll give you where I'm coming from. Is exactly what I just suggested. Is that, well, we certainly want to support the school modernization plan, and I'm a big proponent of that. In my opinion, it does need to be founded in fiscal prudence, particularly now more than ever. It needs to be affordable for this entire community. So for me, as I walk this path with you all, and inevitably cast my vote, it's going to be balancing the needs of the schools, obviously alongside the affordability to the community. And if we can kind of make that match that I think works well, I'm certainly going to support it, because as I've said from the beginning, I believe school modernization is far overdue. We should have done it many years ago. I wish we did, but we didn't. And we need to try to figure out a solution. Unfortunately, these are tougher times than maybe some others in the past, and I'm a little concerned by that. But nonetheless, very open-minded to a plan and hoping to support you guys to drive a plan forward.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your feedback, both Mr. Jesscott and Mr. Orris. Thank you very much. Anyone else from the town council like to speak?
Tim Slocum, just to follow on to Jim's statement about borrowing, the 25 million or the 40 million, whatever's added. Those, of course, are just what we're borrowing. It doesn't limit necessarily what what we're not saying what you're spending. Obviously, there's reimbursement involved. We're not borrowing money that's getting reimbursed, you know. So if you have a $90 million project, we're borrowing, I think what, 60 million is, what's the ratio on renovation, guys? But obviously, we're not talking about bringing your total building project down to a certain level to meet that debt level total. It's really just what we have to finance against granted monies. Maybe everyone knew that answer, but I think it is important to know that as you get costs, some of it is being financed by the state.
And
Great.
to answer your question, our current reimbursement rate is about 46% for renovations, 36% for new construction.
Right. And I guess a follow on to that is, and maybe it's too soon to get an answer, but in terms of your own investigative process, is there a general consensus coming out of your out of the consultant or even out of your own conversations that renovating is considered to be a way to go for a variety of reasons? Number one, because we can do it potentially, and number two, because it's more affordable. Is there really answers to that, or is that still in search of an answer?
We're still in the analysis phase of that, and we're going to be hearing some options today from Colliers about what we could possibly be doing, but nothing on the table right now. Renovations are definitely a possibility, as well as new construction. So we're just really in the initial phases of trying to figure all of that out.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman, this is David Borrowy. I don't know if you can hear me clearly or not, but thank you.
I can, thank you.
But thank you for inviting us tonight. I've been following your meetings on YouTube. Some are easier to follow than others, but in terms of hearing and all that, so I've gotten some of the paperwork. I do want to thank you guys for your work so far. I think Colliers has been an excellent choice. With their professionalism and their experience that they have, they're serving the town well. So I think you folks did a great job with picking them and having them serve us in the town. It appears from the numbers that I looked at, that I couldn't hear well last week, but I saw that Arnett sent out to all of us, that the elementary school population is going to go back to where it was a few years back. And so it does look as though it's heading up as opposed to the big decrease that we've had. So, but it appears to be leveling off at levels we've already had within the schools that we still have. So my guess is that one track is you may not be looking then at a new school, you may be looking at renovations. And if you're looking at renovations, we certainly did them back in 1996. We did Norton, Doolittle, and Dodd. So certainly the schools can be renovated. Colliers has said an inventory of the buildings looks solid, and I think that's one way to go. I think if you're looking at doing new construction, one thing that I've not heard talked about was a magnet school. They certainly have higher reimbursement rates, and they don't have to have a high percentage of students from other towns. But I think that that may be something to look at if you're considering a new build and new construction. I like that at least to be part of the conversation so that we can see where that may fit in terms of cost. And I don't know what grade level you would do that at. If there was a strong desire that sixth grade belonged with seventh and eighth, because we seem to have an odd middle school that's 7 and 8, then just, you know, how the circumstances made that happen over the years. But if your desire to recommend that, as long as the numbers come in. And then my third point that I want to say is that the numbers do have to come in, that we can't go significantly above the numbers for net debt as a percentage of our budget in order to keep the borrowing affordable. If we were to go and borrow $50 million and all of a sudden now we're at 12 or 13% of our budget and we lose our AAA rating, that's going to cost us more to borrow that money. Instead of getting 2.5%, 3% for the money, we're going to be paying 3.5%, and that's significant over the 20-year life of a bond, and it's significant in what we're limited in cost. A fourth point that I'd like to make is that I think one aspect that you probably have already talked about, I heard tangentially related, is that when you do look at what the cost is for the renovation, also look at the avoidance costs that you've had by doing that. so that we can know when we're making the decision of what to move forward with, that, well, it may cost us $2 million a year in debt service, but it's saving us $500,000 in items that we would be doing otherwise. So in terms of maintenance, in terms of HVAC systems, windows, whatever may need to be done, additional spacing because of different programmatic needs and whatnot. I did hear when Darcy school staff presented to one of your subcommittees that Mr. Gustenberg runs, I heard them talking about the need for additional space and bathrooms and things like that. And if that's all needed, well and good, that's got to be done as part of your overall plan. And so I did want those points to be at least part of the conversation, because those will be some of the things that I'm looking for in making a decision of what we move forward to the voters.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Who wants to speak next? Okay, go ahead, Ms. Stefano. You're on mute. We can't hear you.
Mute, and that's a good number sometimes. Anyway, getting back to my question, it had to do with phasing and conversations like that obviously have to be going on within your group, no matter what you do. So I presume over time we'll see some kind of an estimate of what you project any proposal timeline to be. So we know if you're renovating a school, you're doing this in another school in 5 years or whatever it may be. That also has to be part of how we analyze the cost of doing this, I assume, with the built-in inflation because of delays getting from one project to the next. Is that sort of part of the plan and part of the planning process? Because obviously that's, yeah, I figured as much, but thought I should ask.
Thank you. Ms. Pavano, I think you had a comment?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. I was on the Board of Education when we went to the town with a new middle school. So I understand what you're going through with everything. But, I know that we're at the point where our schools have to have something done that's more permanent than patching. One of the things I'd like to say is I believe that it's very important that when you present this to the taxpayers, that it's done in phases so that the taxpayers are not overwhelmed, that they can see if you choose plan A, what you can add or take out or whatever, so that the taxpayers are not overwhelmed by the numbers. And again, I agree with the rest of the council. We must stay physically responsible. And I know that you are doing a wonderful job, and I commend all of you for all the time that you're putting into this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anyone else like to speak?
I'll say something. I just have one quick thing, because I know Tim touched on it earlier about the phasing, and that's an important thing, because I think we were talking during meetings about could be a 4 or 5 phase project, and it's 4 or 5 phase project could go over 10, 15 years, and that's going to be a little bit complicated when we're trying to figure out the amount that we're going to be bonding each year. And when you think about what Mr. Orr said with the $75 million bond, it would cost a 2.5% mill increase average. It's a lot of money to people, because you have to remember, it won't be the only thing that will maybe added to the mill rate each year, and there might be others. And to increase that mill rate to people on fixed incomes and businesses could be costly. So we have to be very prudent in how we do this over the period of years. But it has to be done one way or another. We're going to have to bite the bullet, and we're going to need to really find ways to fix the schools that we have. And if we have to rebuild one or build one, then we're going to make sure that it is going to be the right build for us and at the right price for us. It's just not something that I know none of us are taking it lightly, and I'm glad that we're doing this way, so that we can all understand the ramifications of our decisions. It's just the SMC decision, but it's going to be the Board of Ed's decision and the Town Council's decision, and we all have to deal with that. So the phasing is going to be more, I think, of a tricky thing to determine, and I know Chuck's going to probably help us with all of that going down the line, but it's not going to be something that's going to be done quickly.
Okay. Sylvia, go ahead. You're muted though.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. I think you don't need to hear from me. You hear from me enough here, but I think it's important that the financial part of it is explained well to the public whenever we make whatever presentation we decide to do. And that's going to be important for the communications committee to put it in a way. We've seen it in the projects, and we keep referring to South Windsor and some other towns that we've seen successful projects get done. Once we have had the advice of Chuck and Colliers and our committee to determine whatever it is we decide is the most fiscally responsible plan, the way it will be approved by the public is to make sure that they're very well aware of what it's going to cost them and over what period of time. I don't know how to do that. I think the communication committee will probably be talking about that. I think maybe it's going to require some sort of, I don't know, survey or some measurement to see what the appetite is for the taxpayer, because we represent, as Don says, a lot of different segments of the population. I absolutely wouldn't be on this committee if I didn't think all of this was important. So I'm going into it with a positive attitude, but if we're going to be positive about it, we need to make sure that we have all the fiscal pieces lined up so that the residents and taxpayers know what they're getting, and make sure we are indeed, as David said, paying attention to the costs that we may be saving because of the new things that we're doing. The other part about it is we all have talked about this in the committee, that we have to make sure that we're following the changes in the potential reimbursement rates, because we don't know what's going to happen. This year has been a prime example of things changing by the minute. So we need to be flexible enough to not bank on things for the next 10 years, but to give ourselves room to change with the circumstances as they may or may not happen. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Gulliver?
Thank you very much. And first, I like other people have said, I'd like to thank this commission and committee for all the work it's been doing. I mean, this is quite a difficult task, and gathering a lot of information, and ultimately it's for a very important goal for the future of Cheshire. So thank you all for serving and doing a great job in what you're doing. It's been very helpful and educational, and obviously we all want to see where this goes. I won't take too much time because I think all the other commissioners have done a great job council members have done a great job of echoing sentiments that I have, as well as making sure that we got to come in with something that's reasonable, but you all know that, and ultimately something that's going to be phased in probably over time, and something that the taxpayers are going to understand and be able to have a great amount of buy-in for, because it's going to be very important for all aspects of what's happening in town. One question I did have is, in some of your research with Colliers, and maybe they'll talk about this later, or maybe you have already, I apologize for this. Has there been a preference stated or intimated by the state as to whether they would prefer something like this project be a rehab or a new building? Have they given any indication one way or the other is whether the state has any preference for what this project looks going forward, or has it been completely up to us? Or I'm just curious if the state has given any kind of guidance on this project yet.
Chuck, I see you unmuted yourself. I'm assuming you have something to say.
Yeah, sure. Chuck Warrington with Colliers. Yeah, so with respect to this project, we haven't really met with OSCGR yet. We're waiting to develop the plans. However, we do work with other districts and work with the state. And the state is taking what I think is a very smart approach to what projects they participate in and whether they're renovation or new. they're going to look at, if we're going to do a renovation project in regards to the school, they're going to want to see what studies has the district done, looking at all your system, your MEP systems, your physical conditions for that school, when we're looking at a specific project. And in a nutshell, they want to make sure that, are we putting good dollars into a school that's worth renovating, or is it to the point where it's not worth renovating, you got to build new? Last year in New Fairfield, they had a high school that was had a lot of problems early in its lifespan in the 70s and had structural deficiencies. Casa Diamantis, who's the director of that unit, walked through the school himself, looked at the past reports, and basically said, we're only going to participate in the new. So in that instance, he says, we're not going to put good money versus bad and waste state taxpayers' dollars, nor do they believe it's in their best interest. So they're going to take it a case-by-case basis. But more importantly, they're going to want to see the holistic plan. And that's one of our points you'll see in our approach tonight as we're looking at these options. And in last month, there's guidelines from the state that say, we want you to look at a holistic approach at your district and look at all the options, not just one school at a time. So they're taking a very practical approach. I used to work for the state for 20 years, and it hasn't always been that way with the state of Connecticut. And now they're really looking at it to spend those dollars wisely. So when you see the bonding, a lot of people are saying, well, they're cutting costs. Well, they're not necessarily cutting the costs. Yes, the bonding's gone down from 800-900 million down to the 400 and 500 millions. It's only because they're selecting the projects better, they're vetting them out better, they're making districts do more homework. So that's the reason for that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that's very helpful because obviously we want to make sure, whatever we do, obviously the state's going to be a partner in that. And so I appreciate that feedback on that. And so I do think it's going to be important for us as we go forward to see what those options are. And I looked at the materials that were distributed for this meeting and looking at population trends, where we're going. It seems that the elementary school is going to see, at least according to these charts, a sort of a potential estimated spike first before we get to the junior high and high school level. And so that may also, I assume, play a part in whatever this commission decides to do going forward. Because I know obviously we started with the idea of a new middle school, but who knows where that could go with looking at these numbers, that we may start at an elementary school level and work our way up. But obviously, those are all things that this commission is going to be charged with looking at. And I trust that this commission is going to come up with a lot of great ideas. And so thank you all very much for what you're doing. And obviously, we look forward to, as the town council, being a partner with you in this process. So thank you.
Thank you. And just so you know that we haven't really started with a middle school approach in this. I know that's where the plan was in 2017. We're kind of taking a step back and looking at the data to make sure that we look at this from scratch again and make sure that we're making the right decisions. So
right, and I appreciate that too. And that's one of the better benefits of this commission, is having that opportunity to look at the whole process and all avenues of where we could go. So thank you.
Yep, thank you. Anybody else?
I want to say something real quick.
Go ahead, Mr. Jinks.
Sure. Yeah. So just speaking as the town council role anyway for the moment. I'm eager to get through those scenarios with Jim Jascott as far as cost and fund balance and all the different variables involved in maintaining our credit rating and so on and so forth, which I'm sure we'll do as the SMC moves forward. But obviously we need to first start to look at the, what's the sort of best scenario going forward in terms of education, in terms of the schools and the students. So I'm certainly really eager to start to look at that from Colliers tonight. So I hope that serves as a nice little segue, Jen.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, I believe we got to hear from all of the counselors. Thank you all very much for coming. Does anyone have any questions of the counselors while they're here and we're talking about this? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to the second part of this agenda item, the roles and responsibilities of the town council SMC members. So similarly to what we talked about in our last meeting with the Board of Ed members, there has been a clear definition as far as what your role was to be able to bring information from the SMC meetings back to your respective committees. So I believe there has been someone that has been reporting back to the town council everything we're doing, any issues that come up, things like that. But I just wanted to reinforce the fact that it's a two-way street. So that representation also goes the other way, where if there is something that comes up in the town council that you want us to know about, we do want to hear about it. And we are expecting that in our meetings, we will get a report back from whoever on the town council is present that can speak to it. So just like we have later on in our agenda, a report from the BOE members, I also want to do something similar for the town council members so that we have a moment in our meetings to talk about anything that might have come up from the town council meetings that we can bring back to the SMC meetings to make sure that we're all staying informed and aware of what's going on. So does anyone have any concerns about that or questions, comments, anything? Sound good? Yes? Okay, awesome. Okay, so that's it for item number 4. Item number 5 is our status report from Colliers. So I'm going to hand it over to Chuck, and he's going to lead this discussion.
Great. Thanks, Jen. I appreciate that. Just to address one of the items, I think the issue of magnet schools got brought up. So I thought I would touch upon that a little bit from the little bit that I know. Yeah, years ago, magnet schools were certainly very popular. From what I've heard from the state, and I won't say that this is official. I believe the state is starting to, I won't say move away, but for lack of a better term, moving away, or they're going to be analyzing those proposals more closely, only because I think some districts have used the magnet designation purely from a reimbursement rate because it is 80%. It doesn't constitute renovation status. Just FYI, it's purely a reimbursement rate. But what they're looking at when districts propose it, the way I understand it, they're looking very closely at the benefits in the attracting from other districts and having that multi-district attraction to it. So they'll look at that very, very closely. I don't have a lot of experience with those, but they're not as common as they used to be in the past. And they're starting to kind of hone down on those a little bit. So I just thought I would touch upon that.
Hey, Chuck,
yes.
Real quick, before you get, I appreciate the comment there on the magnet school stuff. Before you jumped into like the first agenda item there, kind of wanted to just reset the group, let everybody know where we were at. And then you can turn it over and do the update on the options there. So
yeah,
as of the meeting last week, obviously everybody had gotten the enrollment projections update from Malone and McBroom. They kind of walked through the latest on the by school approach there. And that's really the jumping off point to kind of start developing some of these options, some of these scenarios that the refinement committee there will assist Colliers in, narrowing those down a little bit for us. So the initial review of the data, Colliers is really just looking at the data and seeing what that tells us to help develop a couple of these options and these initial scenarios. And then we'll have the feedback from the full committee from there. And then Renee's group will kind of work with them in between now and the next meeting to take that feedback, refine those options a little bit. So just to kind of preface where we're at with Colliers, and yeah, go ahead, Chuck, if you want to present what you got there.
Great, thanks, Chuck. I appreciate it. Yeah, this week, obviously, we really looking at the projection enrollments as well as the capacity analysis that Malone and McBroom had provided to us at the last meeting, and that's really driving a lot. Those are the numbers that we've needed to really start assessing the different options. So I'm going to share, make sure I get the right one there. Multiple screens makes it a little bit tricky. So everybody see that there? So so we started looking at our the initial scenarios, and I know this is probably the part that everybody's been kind of waiting for, and to see what we come up with, and so myself, John Koplis is here with me tonight. We started looking at some of these options again based upon the data, based on what Malone McBroom is forward to us, and also taking into account our site visits at each of the schools. for that. So some of the considerations before we dive into the scenarios, I wanted to kind of talk through some of the factors and scenarios we're going to be looking at. A lot of them, I think some of our town council members that have kind of touched upon already. As we go through, you'll see those being kind of discussed. But for our initial scenarios and developments, we're really just looking at needs of the school. And then we'll ultimately look at cost factors and financing and schedules for it. The initial ones, the goal is just to get the ideas out there and solicit feedback from the members to make sure we're not going down a path that is just a no-go, or having not being a member of a citizen of Cheshire. We're not as intimately, knowledgeable of your town as you folks are. So we certainly welcome any feedback if we're going down a wrong path for that. So as Chuck kind of alluded to, the scenarios, at least certainly the first two we're going to present, are really data-driven scenarios. And I think one of our counselors mentioned that, the elementary schools were showing a bit of a need as far as capacity and amount of space and square footage. The other thing, as I mentioned, the state wants districts to look at their plan in a holistic manner, not just looking at one-off school projects, but looking at your district as a whole. Where can you maximize your square footage? Where can you be, if you have to redistrict or realign grades, programs, they certainly appreciate that type of a plan. And that kind of alludes to the South Windsor plan. It was a well thought out plan over 10 years, and they appreciate those. The next is we're looking at the physical square footage needs, again, kind of that elementary school scenario versus the physical conditions. And in our initial thoughts and analysis, in the initial scenarios, they're driven by the need for additional student capacity versus the physical plant needs. Meaning, if you don't have enough space for your students coming in, that's probably, and I welcome any comments, probably a bigger problem than the physical conditions of the school itself. They're both very important. However, if you don't have enough room, you either have to rent portables, you have to build additions or new schools or whatever have you. So we think initially that the space needs are probably a bigger driver than the physical needs, but you'll see that those physical needs do come into play ultimately in these scenarios. We mentioned that, but ultimately we always re-stress, we work for you, and that the prioritization of these scenarios is fully with the committee, and for you to tell us, and choose how you're going to proceed. We're just here to provide the data to you, so you can hopefully make a very informed decision, as we were talking about earlier. So those are some of the considerations and thoughts. And again, there's going to be, again, fiscal considerations as we move forward, but these are for this evening's scenarios that we're looking at. So how do we evaluate the capacity needs of the schools? Last week, I think we all saw this chart that Malone and McBroom presented, and this is just one of the examples. I'm using Chapman's as a snapshot, but basically looking at, they calculated the capacity of each school. Here at Chapman, that solid blue bar is the total capacity, 100% based upon the number of general classrooms, multiplied by approximately 21 students per classroom through the school. And then we're also calculating what we're calling the functional capacity, if you will, and that's a 90% of that total capacity, because in any plan, as a rule of thumb, you want to have some expansion capabilities and going back to being flexible with your budget. You want to have some flexibility with your school. So if you get a bump in enrollment or a larger cohort that comes through, you have room to move and grow with that and fluctuate with that. So we use a 90% of the total capacity to look as our target, if you will. The next step, and step two, is based upon the projections. We're going to run calculation. And this spreadsheet is one we've kind of shared before, but this is the state of Connecticut's space standard worksheet. For those who haven't seen it before, you can obviously see the graph up above, and it gives us square foot per pupil based upon the total enrollment for the school and then the grade. And basically, the lower the enrollment, the higher per square foot in the respective grade. But as you get higher in enrollment, you're going to have better efficiencies per se. So you'll see those square footage numbers decrease. So if you look at grade 3, it goes from 124 to 120 down to 116 and to 112, and that's pretty typical. But what we've done is, and we've done this already, is we've taken looked at the 8-year projected enrollments from Malone McBroom, and in some cases the 10-year, because by the time you select an option and we submit a grant application, it might be that 10-year period. So we actually use 10 years in our analysis right now. And what it does, it tells us what the state of Connecticut, and this is a state of Connecticut function, Department of Education, OSCGR, this tells them what they think what they think the school should be for size, and it's a guide. But more importantly, this is what they're willing to reimburse you on. So when we're looking at the fiscal end of things in reimbursement, we can't have a school that's too big because, one, they won't accept the application. More importantly, and that's their new policy, is if you're over the space standard too much, they're probably going to push back and tell you to look at it again. But two, it tells us, is an existing school too big, too small? What are the needs? And it's an indicator. It's not the only one, but it is a strong indicator. Programmatic needs come into play, special programs come into play, but it's a starting point to tell us where to look. The third step of what we did is we looked at the ratio of the 8-year enrollment versus that functional capacity, saying, are you going to have more kids in a school than what you can hold? Pretty simple. That's just, again, another factor. And there's a few trends that we're gonna show here in a few moments. And then ultimately, we want to compare the space standard ratios to that and see if there's any correlation between the capacity of the schools and what your ratios are. And we have some pretty interesting information on that. Any questions so far on the space standard ratio or the capacities or the projections that I can answer?
Oh, Jen, I can ask a question, Madam Chair. Hi.
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, David Veliber on the council, and I have a couple questions for you. In looking at this, my question is, obviously with COVID, there's some, and factoring that in now. Right now, you're already seeing schools, right, with what we currently have, having issues as far as space and capacity. I guess my question is, when they're calculating these capacities, I assume these numbers are sort of pre-COVID numbers, that is not factoring in that students have to be, 6 feet apart and all in some of these other things. So I guess my question is, how would COVID affect some of these numbers as far as capacity goes? And does it affect the square footage per pupil? Is that calculated in these numbers? And also, and then I have another question about projection of students, but we'll get to that. But I guess ultimately my question is, when it comes to capacity, are these numbers based on sort of pre-COVID, kids can sort of be right on top of each other, or is this more based on calculating more that the kids have to be more spaced out? So I guess we have to ultimately assume at some point in time, even if COVID ends, there may be some other situation in the future where we may have to contemplate more space between students with something else in the future. So I'm just curious how those numbers play out.
Yeah, no, great question. And that's being asked by a lot of folks these days. So this is pre-COVID numbers. When they're looking at the capacity, they're looking at the general classrooms. And they went through it our last presentation. If there's a recording on that, Rebecca Auger from Malone McBroom kind of went through that of how they came up with the capacity. So that it doesn't take into account COVID. The second part, how will COVID affect these numbers? My experience with the state, again, I was with them for 20 years and we've all lived here for a while, is the state of Connecticut doesn't necessarily move too quickly when it comes to changing standards, building codes, requirements. They're pretty slower and not quick to change it. I don't expect the Department of Education to change these too quickly either. They're probably going to take a wait and see approach and evaluate all the districts and get a lot of input. And given we're only 8-9 months into it now, they're probably still studying it. So we'll have to stay in close touch with them when we meet with them and analyze that and ask them if there's any adjustments. Probably the one factor for COVID that's probably more important is the MEP systems in these schools when we're designing them, designing that flexibility and capacity to have higher fresh air turnovers in the school. With high performance buildings, there's already these systems already complex and provide a lot, but that's probably easier to adjust than building a larger building that is going to be there for a 50, 60-year period. So those are some of the systems we're going to be looking at, but we'll keep on track with the state with that.
Thank you very much.
You had a second question?
Yeah, but it was just curious. It was going to be more towards the student projections and whether. But so when we get to those numbers, I'll ask at that point.
Great. I think Mr. Jenks may have had a question.
Yeah, I don't know. I might have just answered it myself, but that's probably not the case. Let me ask the question. So you were saying earlier that the state would kind of push back if we're going for a larger space, but if we're, based on the Mylon McBroom projections, it looked like, student population was going to be going up, fairly significantly in the relatively near future. So if we're building for that, I assume the state takes our local projections into account, I guess, right?
100%. Yes, that's why if you look at the requirements for a grant application, updated student enrollment projections are a requirement, and they take the highest of the 8-year projection enrollment as the maximum square footage of reimbursement. And this screen's a little bit small, but and I can forward this to anybody, but basically it's calculating this sample 57,000 square feet for the future of Doolittle. And right now Doolittle's just under 74,000 square feet. So what that's saying, if you can read it, 77%, that the building for the projected enrollment is oversized by about roughly 17,000 square feet. But if you have a school that's bigger, we're going to come up on that. It supports doing additions, or if we were to build new, they're going to support that need, and that the projection enrollments support that need.
Okay, good. So they allow us to plan ahead pretty well.
100%, absolutely. And they only go out 8 years. So one thing is we're looking at the scenarios and the phasing, we're going to look at those out years on your school and go, okay, is it advantageous to submit a grant application earlier or a year later? If we can grab some more square footage, that might be part of the equation, depending on what it looks like.
Yeah, it seemed like based on the enrollment numbers, that might be the scenario for us, perhaps.
Definitely, especially in the elementary schools, for sure. I think that's probably the next slide we're going to kind of look at here. Is there any more questions, Jen, out there? I only have a few people on the screen that I see.
Yeah, I'm having trouble seeing everybody too. If anyone has a question and we don't see you, just put something in the chat so it gets our attention, and we can take a pause and address it.
Okay, great. Last week there's a couple of key slides that we saw, these graphs that are really visually, they tell the story to us. And I think I'm sure to many of you, you've probably seen the same thing, that that solid blue line in each of the graphs is showing the capacity. The dotted line is that functional at 90% capacity. And then the orange is the enrollment. So anywhere that orange bar is above it, it means we're not going to have enough room in very layman's terms. But as we look real close to them in here, there's 4 of them. There's Darcy, Chapman, Highland, and Norton. Doolittle's right on the cusp, so I didn't throw it in that mix. I'm looking at the ones that are really an exceedance. Those 4 schools are really showing a future need for space in that. Now, how we resolve that need, that's the next step, right? That's the next discussion, is how do we address this need for additional space in your system? It can come in a lot of different forms and shapes and costs, and that's what we're here to kind of study. But again, this being the data is telling us you definitely have a need in your elementary schools. On the contrary, the middle and high school capacities, they have capacity for those future projected enrollments based upon the capacity. And I think we're going to show pretty similarly with the space standard. So just kind of pause here. Basically, what we're seeing on data as far as space, going back to the physical space needs, the elementary schools are the ones with the need. Middle school and high school, as far as purely square footage needs, you're sufficient for the projected enrollments. All right. So the next step we look at is our space standard calculations, and this is using that spreadsheet that I showed earlier. And this is a table that you see here that we started working on actually before we even interviewed, analyzing the district and really trying to get an understanding. These are previously based on the NESDEC enrollments. These have been updated to reflect the Malone and McBroom enrollments. And what's really key here as we're looking at it is anywhere you see a percentage over 100% theoretically says you're going to have a need to grow, or you can grow it, because the amount of students, and this is what the state uses. They're going to say, for example, Chapman, 453 students. Your existing building's 51,200, and the space standard saying 58,000. So approximately, you have about, say, you can afford to build 7,000 square feet according to their math. Now, keep in mind, when we're looking at the actual project, whether it's Chapman or whatever project, the educational specifications in the program of the building is going to come into play on this as well, and we're going to build a program for each school. This is what we did in South Windsor, where we had a specific program. We listed out all the programmatic needs, the classrooms, the administration, and developed a program. And sometimes the program is higher than what the space standard is, and that's where partnering with the state comes into play in explaining that educational need. And that's where space standard waivers come into play potentially, and justifying special programs. So in this graph, you can see three of those being Chapman, Norton, and Highland. Doolittle, kind of like on the graph, if we go back to the graph of Doolittle, that was probably right at the 100%. It was pretty close, and we didn't highlight that one. But in this one, Dodd's also showing some potential capacity, about 10,000 square feet. But when we looked at the capacity analysis from Malone, they're saying we have enough room. So that's kind of an anomaly. That's one of those ones that, depending on how it's organized in the square footage, it's hovering around that 100% on both of the factors, pretty close. So again, anything with 100% exceeding that says there will probably have a need for expansion, or at least you have room for expansion if you wish to do so. And these are numbers, again, guides. They're not hard numbers. They're flexible. They can go up, they can go down, depending on the educational need. So the next one we wanted to is we basically expanded that chart out to the right, and we wanted to compare that capacity versus the utilization and the space standard. And so we're basically comparing up, these two columns here. And so column D, we just talked about with the space standard, but then we looked at, the utilization versus the capacity. And this is basically, I put the equation here, taking our 8-year enrollment and dividing it by what your capacity is. And as we can see, again, this is basically those graphs in a numeric form of 129%, 122 at Chapman, Norton's 118. Again, Doolittle right at 100, right? If you compare that with the space standard, they're right at 100. I think it's almost perfectly right sized, but again, programming comes into play. Highland, 131% on that and 115 there. So So there's some commonalities, and then at Dodd it's 97% on utilization. So not too far off. It's only 10%. It's still pretty close. So that could be a programming issue, depending on how we use the school. The other ones, the high school, you can see they're 92%. There's sufficient capacity. You couldn't substantiate an expansion at the high school with these numbers as they are now. We'd have to do some work in order to support any type of an expansion. So again, capacity ratios tend to reflect the projected space standards for most of the schools, with a couple of one-offs. So basically, we just wanted to kind of compare these up. The capacity needs, again, Darcy, Chapman, Highland, and Norton. And then when we look at where's there room for capacity and space standard, Chapman, Highland, Norton, and Dodd, with these three being the common schools. All elementary schools, again, what this is doing, again, it's data driven. We're using the data to purely tell us where the needs are at. It's not a matter of what we think should be done. We're not taking into physical space needs yet for the physical plant needs. It's just purely on square footage. And they're generally aligning with each other, which is good. That is showing some good consistency there for it. Any questions before I go to the next one? Anything out there, Jen?
I don't see anything in the chat.
There's nothing in the chat.
Okay. Good.
I'm not in the chat, but I just unmuted Tim Slocum. I had a question, if I may.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, and this has to do with sort of the goal of a plan, which may in fact include a middle school down the line. Mm-hmm. And a middle school, as I've been explained to me, is 6 through 8. And given that, doesn't that sort of blow some of these projections out of the water? And how, if it was a goal, say in 7 or 8 years to do a middle school, how would that impact the space projections that you're working on now in a renovating plan of some of these existing schools? It's almost like you have to have parallel plans. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we're working up multiple options. Okay. And one of those options is in fact a new middle school. Because there is a desire, and many districts do have 6 to 8. There's some that do have 7, 8. Some have 5, 8. Branford Francis Walsh Intermediate School is a 5 to 8 program. And what comes into play there is really the educational culture and what your district wants for a culture. Because some parents have reservations about their 5th grader being in a school with an 8th grader because of those changes in those age of students is pretty drastic there. Even at 6th grade, I think we heard some concerns with 6th grade going to with 7th and 8th. I was in a junior high from 6, 7, and 8 myself growing up. I'm sure many of us were. But 7, 8 isn't unheard of. But we have an option on there and some comparisons that I think you might find interesting, Tim, when we get to those.
Okay, good. Well, I figured that had been such a big piece of the initial planning down the line. It seemed to be sort of a goal of at least the administration. It's not a goal of mine, or not necessarily a goal of mine. So I just wondered how it's going to factor in. You've answered that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, what it basically does is, in a nutshell, you take grade 6, all the grade 6 throughout the district, you move it to a new school, and it provides you some breathing room in those elementary schools. In a very simplified answer, it gives you some breathing room, but does it provide the relief that maybe a Highland needs and others? You might still need a little bit of square footage there, possibly.
There's a question from Ann. Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, just going off of what you were just talking about, Chuck. So does the state look at that as the whole big picture? The fact that you're alleviating room in all of your elementary schools by going to construction of a new school that takes the 6th grades out, so that down the road you have room for the growth. I'm just wondering
They will.
how the state looks at that when they're deciding on.
They're definitely going to look at it, and in the way I'm presenting it now, honestly, is kind of the way I envision them grilling us on a plan of what did you explore, what did you not explore, what options did you look at that you didn't choose, and why didn't you? And I think that's ultimately what you need to prove to the taxpayers is why do we select one option over another option, and what were the factors associated with it. But the state, yes, they will look at that in that holistic approach. Years ago, they would just say, okay, we want to do addition at Highland. And then we wouldn't look at the rest of the schools, and then we get passed through. And then there's another school may be highly underutilized with 4 or 5 empty classrooms. We've been in districts where they overbuild one school, but because of the challenge with redistricting, and it is a challenge, it's not an easy thing to do. And it could be hard to sell because you want to stay at the school. Your kids are in a school, and they're going to, especially the parents where the kids are going to be moving. And usually the kids are fine. It's more the parents that we see that are more stressed. But it is a holistic approach that they do look at. Yes.
Thank you.
Looks like there's a question from Rich. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, my question really is, as we're looking at the capacities, one thing that we're not taking into account at all is the fact that our kindergarteners from Doolittle School are not at Doolittle School because there's no space for them. They're being housed presently at Darcy. But I think that one of the things we need to be looking at is if we were to house all of the Doolittle kids at their school, it should include the kindergarten, which would make their capacity needs much higher.
Yeah, Rich, that's a great point. And one of the options we did look at does push them back into Doolittle.
Good.
For sure. In the numbers, I'll be happy to show you the spreadsheet. It might be interesting for you to see. I can definitely pull that up so you kind of see the numbers, right? How's the sausage being made, if you will, to show those numbers.
Got it. Is there any other questions before we keep going?
For a second, Rich, were you kind of alluding to the fact that if we were to put the gardeners from Darcy into these charts that Chuck has, it would show Doolittle as going over the blue line? Is that kind of where you're going with that?
It would put them substantially over that line, yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so I'm just bringing up one of our charts, and this is from, let me see if I can bring up the options here. Actually, it's option 1. So one of the options we analyzed, and I don't want to give away it too early, but one of the options basically alleviates, I think this is the new middle school actually. And if you can see here, same chart, new middle school for 6 to 8 would have to be almost 200,000 square feet. And you're going to see this coming up in one of the options. What it does without even looking at additions or anything else, just as is, without reusing Dodd, potentially as an elementary school, you can see the space standards come down just below 100%, which according to state, they're saying it's right size, but there still might be some needs programmatically. You look at the 8-year utilization, that brings them down drastically as well, closer to that 100%. Is it ideal? Maybe not, but it definitely improves the situation. And if you were to reutilize Dodd, which has 815 student capacity, and I'm just throwing this out as an example. You close Chapman, which has 370. That's 446 students of an excess capacity if you were to take it offline. In that case, you could redistrict, move kindergarten back to Doolittle, and then maybe reorganize, bring some Highland kids over there with those district lines and alleviate further stressed by using Dodd, which is a larger school. But coming in, you know, in that example, again, it's a large school, right? It's basically another Highland. So that's where the discussion with the Board of Ed comes into play, and how it's organized. So that kind of alludes, I think, Rich, to kind of what you might have been talking about in that case. And we took, you can see there's a 0 in Darcy. We moved that into Doolittle as a K-5 there. So that's just a little bit of a sneak peek of what we're going to present to you here shortly. So any other questions out there, Chuck or Jen?
I don't see
That
anything
was
else.
it on the chat.
All right, good. So I'll make sure I answer these as we go here. So getting back to this. So question is, you know, how do we alleviate this space need in elementary schools? Because I think I hope we've demonstrated with the graphs and the numbers that I think in the elementary schools, there's a need for additional space. And the question is, you know, how can we address that? And there's multiple different options, and these are just most of the common ones. I'm sure there's probably others as well, but just kind of wanted to put these out there. We're not endorsing any one of these. I just want to put them out there for thought. And we'll certainly give a copy of this. By the way, Jen, we'll send this to you just so you can have it for the members. But one is simply redistricting of schools. If there was room in another school that had a lot excess capacity, I think we've demonstrated there's really no school that has any excess capacity to move around. So I don't know if that's I don't think that's an option here by itself. One is combination of additions and renovations to the existing schools, adding on square footage. That's certainly an option, but I think with maybe some of those physical conditions needs at some of the schools, it may not be as desirable. We'll evaluate that. Combination of additions, renovations with some redistricting and or closing of schools. I don't know how strong that's going to be. Number 4 is a strong one here. I think this is what we're probably going to be looking at, is combination of constructing a new school, renovating schools, and possibly redistricting a school. Combination of everything here. And that's probably my hunch, my gut says we're probably going to be in that category. And then the other one is you increase your class sizes, because the assumptions with Malone and McBroom were 20 to 21 students per classroom. You increase that to 25. The state looks at them as 25 as their guide, but if you increase that, you do modify your capacity, increase that capacity in your school. So again, that's a programmatic discussion and quality of education and teacher-student ratio that lies with the Board of Ed for the most part. So these are just some possible ways to alleviate those space needs. So now we're kind of getting back to, okay, now we have the data and just again, return it to some of the considerations, the initial considerations, being data driven, a holistic approach. I think we talked about that in a couple different questions of looking at it for the state recommendations. And then, you know, really the physical square footage needs are probably a priority. Again, it's up to your committee if it's a priority. We see it as a priority in the elementary schools. As we look at the options, we're going to be looking at the requirements for renovation status. And I know we had a question of, is the state preferring new versus renovation? And it's on a case-by-case basis. Some schools are very, very good candidates for renovation if they're laid out correctly. If they don't have a lot of accessibility needs that need to be addressed, or code violations, they're structurally sound. There's a lot of factors that go into that. Space standard requirements will be a part of it. I think we demonstrated, we need to look at those as compared to the existing size of the school. Because in the last meeting we talked about, or about a month ago, we talked about renovation status and those requirements. Well, the space standard and the size of the building has to be right size as well in order to get renovation status. So that's kind of a precursor for that. So we'll be keeping these in mind as we look at these. Land availability for additions or a build new scenario. And I know in your previous studies, there were some locations that the consultants looked at, Taisu Kim, Perkins Eastman, Malone looked at. And then ultimately, it's going to come back to that physical plant needs. The conditions of the schools is ultimately going to come in as well. If we're looking at 2 different schools and one has a greater need, you may put that before the other school, or you might take it offline, like high school Chapman Humiston has those needs that we've discussed. So these are all the things we're going to be thinking about as we go forward. So the fun part, the scenarios, and these scenarios. They're still very early. We're still analyzing them. The committee, we weren't able to convene with the whole committee this week just due to scheduling, but we will be next week. So I want to put the caveat, we've looked at it a little bit. I think talked to Chuck a little bit about it, a little bit with Renee, a little bit with Vin, but these are very early. They're not cast in stone by any means. So I don't want anybody to think that they're not changeable, but these are just our initial scenarios. And they're not in any specific order either. That's up to you to prioritize these. So the scenario number one would be to build a new elementary school to alleviate the stresses in the elementary levels. Preliminary thoughts on that would be housing the pre-K and redistributing kindergarten to Doolittle or the other schools, so the respective schools, if you will, and possibly close Darcy in this option. The elementary schools would stay as K to 6. We would not change the middle school from 6 to 8. That would remain as is. The enrollment for a new school is to be determined, but we're estimating anywhere from 600 to 700 students. We'd have to have a discussion on that and work with Malone and McBroom to see where's that sweet spot to alleviate the stresses. And ultimately, I think the goal would be to take Chapman offline at the end of the day. And it may not be immediately. As you can see in the fourth bullet, we may want to use that for swing space to assist with some construction. I'll get to that in a minute. But a new elementary school with 600 to 700 students, roughly 75 to 90,000 square feet. That's using the space standard in our experience on programming and special programs that might be required that would take us above the space standard. You can go above it, but again, a discussion with the state. Just as a point of reference, because I know everybody's so interested in the dollars. The final phase in South Windsor, that's a 101,000 square foot pre-K to 6 school, and that budget is $58.5 million, just for point of reference, to give you kind of an idea for that. Dodd, again, would remain as a middle school and potentially perform your CIP plan, with a roof replacement, window replacement, whatever have you, based upon the needs. Do alterations in a major project, or you could even renovate. But basically, middle school would stay where it's at, and we would address that, and we'd have to discuss to what extent. Again, possibly size new elementary schools to minimize the additions at those other schools. So where they're at that 100% or a little bit over, if we right size that, you may not have to do additions, and we just do renovations at your existing school. So putting good dollars into the new school, renovate the existing, and it helps with any stresses of planning and zoning in your land use, because if they're tight sites, it might be a challenge. You possibly use Chapman as a swing space for the out years, because we'll want to probably address those other schools, Doolittle, Highland, and evaluate those. But keeping Chapman online allows you to move some things around a little bit, possibly. And again, these are just ideas. They're not fully baked. They're not fully vetted out by any means. And then down the road, looking at the entire plan is, do you renovate the high school or perform capital improvement projects? That you can change that verbiage to construct a new high school. Again, in some of these scenarios, just overall, we may interchange some of the parts. This is where we start developing, scenario 1A, 1B, and just changing parts and pieces of each of these. So that's scenario 1. This one resolves the space need in the elementary schools within themselves without touching middle school or high school.
Chuck, we had a quick question on scenario 1 here
Yeah,
from Rich.
sounds good. Please.
He wanted to know how is Humiston dealt with in this plan, or was that part of?
So Humiston in general, I mean, it's important. but it's one of your smaller spaces. And again, we haven't fully cooked these. It would certainly be addressed in every single plan. I think it needs to be, based upon our experience. And again, it's up to your committee. I wouldn't consider that the highest need in these options. I think your elementary schools and your high school really have probably the biggest need in these plans, but it would certainly get baked into their, I don't know how big of a financial pull that would be on this overall plan or demand. So it will be addressed. Again, these are initial drafts and subject to.
So that'll be addressed in the refinement, safe way to say it.
Correct. Yeah. We've been working this for about a week and a half or so, 2 weeks, and these are going to evolve a lot. It's going to be a very iterative process, and we're going to expand and contract these based upon your feedback in the subcommittee as well.
Chuck, the other quick question I had, I assume CIP does not have any reimbursement, correct?
Some may or may not, Richard, like a roof replacement project. The state of Connecticut has a program where they will participate if the roof is over 20 years old and hasn't been replaced. You can apply for a grant application, grant commitment for reimbursement on a roof, code upgrades, window replacements, and then there's a few others that are available for reimbursement.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Anything else, Chuck?
I think that was it. Sorry, Rich, I missed that first part there. I think we're good.
So scenario 2, this is the build new middle school option that we're talking about, since it seems to be a predominant one. That would house we assume it would house grades 6 through 8. Based upon that enrollment, and I was going to, I would like to bring up that option. I think this is option 1, but the new middle school. This is a space standard calculation. If you can see that, can you see the space standard calculation, Chuck? I got three screens going on, so I do apologize. So for that enrollment for 6 to 8 in the future, and we have this chart here. Big old huge chart. We have projected enrollment combinations. So you can see in the out years, and this is 2930. The 6 to 8 goes up to 1,172. And we use that higher one because again, we don't know when we're going to get to it. If we get to it earlier, it might be 1112, but for worst case scenario, we're using that. So we use that value and we basically insert that. And we have to go in this row here, 751 to 1,500. And we enter in these values, average square foot per pupil. It adds this adds up all 3 of these numbers there, divided by 3, and that's our average one, basically 163 square feet per pupil. Multiply that by 1172, and that's where we come up with that 100, almost 91,000 square feet. That's the inside face of walls. So when I say roughly 200,000 square feet, I got to add basically 5% onto the 190. So just kind of roughly 200,000. So that's where we get that number. Does anybody have any questions on that specific calc at all? So I think that's really important to understand how we're getting the numbers and where they're coming from. And that number may go up a little bit based upon program for that. So coming back to that.
So can I ask a quick question? Sorry,
Oh,
I should have put
please,
it in
yeah.
the chat. Question. So a 200,000 square foot building, and I apologize, maybe I should know this, but how big is Dodd now? How much bigger of a building is that versus the existing Dodd building?
Dodd's 128,500 square feet, roughly.
Okay.
So you're about another 72,000 square feet, if I got my numbers right.
Okay.
Plus or minus and what's interesting, it's, it's alleviating some of the stresses, but it's over twice as large as a new elementary school. But again, what's important here is we haven't done any pros and cons on this. And I think that's really partially less and certainly heavily on this committee to develop pros and cons for each of these scenarios, because in a new middle school configuration, that site is pretty small for the existing. Has 2 athletic fields. The vehicular circulation could be certainly improved. I'm sure everybody would agree upon that. So that's part of some of the factors, those physical space considerations is how do you prioritize that? How important is that versus the dollars? And once we vet these out and we start putting those total dollar figures together, like the town council members were mentioning, we're going to be able to evaluate that out and see those side by side.
Right.
When we vet it out.
Excellent, thank you. And I was just curious as that ultimately just to get a feel for scale as to how much bigger a building that would be. So,
yeah, big school,
thank you.
big school. Yeah, and you know, if you compare that to again our South Windsor program, you know, that one's 101,000 at 58.5. You know, you double that, you're roughly 120,000. So it's not too far off from what your prior estimates were at 115, 113 range. So I think those numbers are not too far off. We'll do a detailed cost budget analysis for it with a range, but that's not too far off probably for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Then that site would have to be around 25 acres. The state of Connecticut for middle school, say 15 acres is recommended for a middle school plus 1 for every 100 students. So, you know, your 15 plus 12 should probably be more close to 27 acres, but that's just a approximation. So you have to find property, number one, then buy it and examine it. Then in this case, we're thinking, you know, repurpose some middle schools and elementary school. We kind of talked about that in a little bit earlier when I was kind of showing you what we're looking at. You know, there's 800 kid capacity, student capacity at Dodge. So if you close out Chapman, you're gaining 446 students roughly for capacity. That's a lot of students to gain capacity. Redistrict the rest of the elementary schools to a K-5, potentially close Chapman. So as you build a new middle school, you can use Dodd or Chapman potentially in these next phases to if you were to modify the elementary schools, if that was the next phase of this option, or you just simply redistrict and you have enough room and you can go and look at the high school and do renovations there if that was your priority. And we have that as a bullet. Perform alterations, renovations remaining elementary schools using Dodd or Chapman as swing space. And then you finally reconfigure. And then you could renovate the high schools in this case. And if you wanted to do that and put that before the alterations, again, we'll calculate that, or CIP projects. That's kind of an animal in itself. Large school, that's 65,000 square feet we have. Big project, big project. So when you're talking a new middle school, you know, we're talking fiscally responsible options, you know, a new middle school, over $100 million, high school at 265,000. That's another, you know, if you renovate, that's another large project. So when we're looking at the time span, that's where our debt service and our financial experts come into play. Mr. Jaska would advise us on that of what can be tolerated. And again, Malone and McBroom, they would have to redistrict elementary schools and look at different options to see where they come into play. So scenario one, start with a new middle school, and then size it appropriately to redistrict. And then it would replace Chapman, use that as some swing space. And scenario two is building a new middle school.
Chuck, real quick, I think you misspoke there. Scenario one would be to build a new elementary school.
Elementary school, correct. Yep, sorry about that. Yeah, scenario one's new elementary school.
Then redistrict. And scenario two would be build a new middle school, still redistrict, and both involve Chapman in some form.
Yeah, that's what we're thinking, and we still got to cook these a little bit more, but that's the high level thought, you know, initially for it. Any questions on scenario two before I go to scenario three? I got 4 total. Nothing so far. I can always go back if we have to. Scenario three. Again, we talked about. I know there's been some thoughts of starting with the high school. potentially renovate the high school. This is a case where the physical needs of the high school would be outweighing the space needs of the elementary schools. Again, up to you. We anticipate that being a large cost to do so. 265,000 square feet. That's a big school. Hundreds of, in the hundreds of millions. I don't know the exact number, but certainly over 100 million. And then with that scenario, once that's completed, you're still going to have the space need requirements of the elementary school. So essentially, it would go back to either, in summary, and we can detail it more, scenario 1 or scenario 2 to address those needs. You kind of come back to scenario 1 and 2 if you put the high school first. And there might be another option there that we're missing, but at first pass, it's kind of seems that we're going at. But by the time you get to that, you're going to be really deep into those outer years, probably the 5, 6, 7, 8 school years, for that. And it could be a stress there. And then ultimately, perform capital improvement plans, and projects to the middle school. You could renovate it, but get into renovating that, you're talking, I think, some big dollars, but we can certainly put numbers to that for you to evaluate. Probably not as attractive as scenario 1 or 2, but that's your call. Scenario 4, we put this one here because there was a recommendation potentially look at constructing a new high school. I think possibly at the existing site, but we haven't vetted that out. Again, it's subject to having property available. In that option, obviously another fairly large price tag for that. And the question there is, what do we do with the existing high school after that? Do you demolish it and create parking for it if the new school is on the existing site, or do you repurpose 265,000 square feet? Do we repurpose that and make that a middle school from, say, 5 to 8, because a grade 5 to 8 enrollment in the future is 1,516 students, and based upon a 90% functional capacity of the high school is 1,500. So you're basically right there, according to Malone's analysis, to accommodate grades 5 through 8. The big question is can that site handle it? You have a lot of students on one site. Your grades 5 through 12 on one campus might be a struggle there, but that's something we can certainly study further as we go. Those two projects in themselves, if you renovated and built new, they're huge projects, and I think you'd end up leaving your elementary schools. You could repurpose Dodd, close Chapman again, redistrict those elementary schools. But if you did it in that order, you're going to have a stress on your elementary schools for those. So again, these are scenarios that the subcommittee, we haven't really had a real strong chance to vet them with the subcommittee yet due to schedules, and there may be additional scenarios as we go through these. I expect us to have some offshoots, some scenario 1A and 1B and 2A and 2B, and those we'll definitely take a look at based upon feedback.
Madam Chair, if I may say a comment.
Yes, sir.
See, it's good.
I think it's Renee.
Yeah,
Yeah, go
so
ahead,
thank you for the summary, Chuck. I appreciate it. So just to go back a little bit, when we were discussing some of these options last week, Chuck, I think it was helpful to see the map of the whole district.
Oh yeah, let me see if I can bring that up, Renee. I should have folded that up.
I actually have it here. I can share my screen real quick here.
You want to share? I'll stop sharing there. Yeah, I was going to pull that in, and I think I just got sidetracked.
So if we focus for a second on that option 1, or that scenario 1 of that elementary school, we're basically talking about building an elementary school that will cover basically the north side of town, right?
That was some of our preliminary thoughts, Renee, just kind of looking at it graphically and, looking at Highlands in Chapman. It seemed to make sense to, if available, put it up in that northern part of the town.
Yeah, I think it's worth, even though I know it's a preliminary plan and this is not what is happening, but I think from a visual standpoint, it is important for the committee members and the council members to see what the effects of this would be, which basically, on that north side of town, there is, you have Chapman, you have Darcy, that are the two schools serving that area, and they happen to be two of the schools that have most physical plant needs. And they also have to be some of the schools that have some of the major concerns over capacity in the next following years. So that scenario one really does address two key issues with one shot, and then as a bonus, it does alleviate the overcapacity issues that Doolittle may have by moving some of these uh, purple points here into that new school. So it really addresses three issues. Um, and from a bang for the buck standpoint, given that it will be a smaller building than the middle school, it will be less expensive, probably under the $100 million, etc. I think it is an option worth studying and considering. And as a further steps to that, taking care of the other buildings, such as Highland, the high school, etc. I think that given that the investment on such building will not be as high for starter in comparison with others, I think it may leave appetite for exploring other options in subsequent years. But anyway, I just wanted to share the graphic of the town and the effects of that, because I when I saw it in that fashion, that's when it really clicked on me. That scenario one.
Chuck, I had a kind of a follow-up question, just looking at the map and back to how you explained that option one there. In that area you were talking about, we could size that elementary school to take the population of Chapman, and the redistricting would be mainly in that Highland area to kind of balance that out. So the size of that is closer to where it should be over that 8-year span. And what about Darcy? So we were talking about the kindergarten going into Doolittle, but that pre-K program was still shown as a population. Is that an option to include that in a new elementary school build? So Darcy itself would be empty in that scenario, or no?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're doing that in phase 3 for Pleasant Valley up in South Windsor. They've reintroduced their preschool program into that school there. So yes, that is definitely an option. To either put it in or not put it. Really, you got to weigh them all out and go what's most advantageous for the district. Even though we take what I think it's important to understand is, even though say if we moved it there and Darcy's not housing a program, unless you sell the building or demolish the building, there's still operational costs to heat it, insure it, electricity, clean it. It doesn't just go away. And I think we've seen, in the past where some other districts like, oh, well, we won't have that expense. There's still a large, a good percentage of the expenses from a maintenance perspective, because it is an asset that you have to protect and maintain. So we'll just have to calculate what those costs are in that scenario, like say on a yearly basis. And I think Ben has some of those costs or estimated costs that we'd have to incorporate in that scenario.
I guess just a follow-up thought I had on that was, if that building were empty, we could weigh the costs of that being renovated to house what's currently at Humiston and bringing Humiston offline versus keeping Humiston and ridding ourselves of the Darcy building. So there'd be a option to do either one there, no?
Absolutely. I mean, in these scenarios, to look at these, they're not like, I'll say extensive efforts. I mean, that's why like that would be like a 1A, then a 1B, a 1C. And they're just little adjustments and fine tuning. And once you get the core, I'll say option established in the budgets established, these are just tweaks to consider additional offshoots from these.
Chuck, this is
It
Sylvia.
was, yeah, go ahead, Sylvia.
Can I just, those were thoughts that I had as I was watching this, and I thought the Darcy option could be the Hummiston option. One of my comments, the north end of town is fairly industrialized, and a lot of that area is zoned for industrial or commercial. But part of the plan for the portion that's at the 691 interchange is to have some housing. I'm not sure what that is, but that might change the demographic of the number of students that are in that area as well. And I don't know what other land is available for new build and new construction for homes, but that is probably the least dense population and has the potential of increasing. So if the school is built there, it needs to be sized enough to take into account any potential increase in students at that north section of town. I think it makes sense to me to do that and to take Chapman and move it into a new school and make it larger to accommodate some of that. As I look at this map, I'm thinking some of the Highland School population that is in the green up there could be accommodated by that school as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah, Sylvia, those are definitely some of our initial discussions. And you basically, when you see, the Chapman, that little piece that goes across Route 10, you basically, almost draw a line from there and just take that whole northwest corner along with Chapman and redistrict that to the new one. One of the things we were talking about with Malone, they were involved with some early studies, and there was a proposal for a middle school. I think one of the middle schools at the corner of Jarvis, and I'm looking at the site right now, Jarvis and Marion, for that large school. So if it could accommodate that, it could assume if it's still available. And I think, I don't know if you can point where that's at, Renee, at the corner of Jarvis. Yeah, right there. It's relatively central. Again, you got to look at what's available, but it's relatively central to that portion of the town. And it, there's some site considerations, but it doesn't look like it's unsurmountable from a very high, 50,000 foot, level, if you will.
And that's a dense population area right there because there are new homes there, and there's also a condominium complex at the corner of Jarvis and Marion Road, and that right in that area, actually, not a little bit. You see that green there, a little bit farther to the west, but that would be close for those kids who live there. It would make sense. Lots to think about.
Yes.
Is there any other questions? Go ahead, Rich.
Just a quick question on scenario 2, and I know you said there's going to be 2A, 2B, 2C, whatever.
Sure.
Was there, knowing what the financial constraints are at this point, was there discussion at all of a 7-8 middle school rather than a 6-8 middle school, which would be obviously substantially cheaper?
Well, I think not at this point, not to say it's not, but my initial thoughts, Richard, is the purpose of the new middle school being 6 to 8 is that we're taking them that sixth grade level across the district and removing them from, taking them out of the elementary schools. That provides that some relief to the elementary schools.
If 7-8 middle school, you then have Dodd.
Yeah, correct. And as soon as you said that, I thought about that. So you could redistrict into Dodd, and that's got a lot of capacity.
Yeah.
It definitely has
I
capacity.
think it price things out. I personally, at least, would like to see what pricing would be. I'm just trying to think. I know the town is saying that there's some real fiscal constraints here, I want to see if whatever plan we come up with
That's a
is
great idea.
tolerable to the town.
Yeah, I'm writing that down so we don't forget about it. That's a good. That might be an option in its own, just being because it's 7-8. But that's a great example of that.
There was just real quick, Rob, I see your hand there. There's just one comment from Sandy that about the property. I think we can hold any of the property discussions to later on as we get into the plans a little bit farther there. But go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Chuck. And to the other Chuck, quick question to follow up on Mr. Gussenberg's question. If you did do a new middle school 7 through 8, you then have capacity in Dodd, which is pretty sizable. Would you then look at maybe potential additional consolidations in addition to Chapman, maybe Darcy, and also Humiston? Because to me, those are the 3 schools that are probably going to cost a lot to upgrade, ADA compliance, et cetera. So those are 3 schools, at least in my mind, that if we can develop a good plan, maybe we can somehow, put those 3 buildings to the side, eliminate them in our process here.
Agreed. Absolutely, Rob. If we're going to do that, let's maximize. I would recommend we maximize the use of Dodd as much as we can. Talking with the district and going, what can we relocate there? We'd have to look at kind of the floor plan too and see how it's programmed, because we take, say, if we took pre-K, for example, and put it in is there a portion of the building that we could isolate it as within itself? But absolutely, the answer is yes. We'd want to maximize that 128,000 square feet as much as you can.
And just to follow up, because just from my understanding, if you did the 6 through 8 middle school, you wouldn't get enough additional capacity by pulling the 6th graders out of the elementary schools to eliminate anything more than just Chapman, correct?
Let me bring that up here just to kind of show you, I think.
I'm trying to, it seems like scenario 1 may be the most fiscally or at least expensive option. But number 2 may provide more of what the school system's looking for. So I'm trying to figure out, in my mind, if you went with the 6 through 8, created capacity, obviously in the elementary schools, there needs to be some renovation there. But could you do more consolidation than just Chapman? Could you do Humiston and Darcy as well in that scenario?
Very possible. I think what's in, and I'm just kind of going off the top of my head, Rob, I think what's important there is how does Dodd, if we're to, well, we would actually move things around, because, Darcy doesn't necessarily go into Dodd. It might get relocated to Doolittle and with some relief. But I think we just have to see where the parts of the puzzle get moved to. And does it work for the district from an operational standpoint is probably the biggest question. But no, I think you're right on there with, it does provide a lot of relief, because in this sample, again, there's 128,000 square feet. It's a big facility. And how can you take advantage of that with these other facilities? So a lot of merit to that, definitely.
Thank you.
Chuck, I had a quick question on the using Dodd as an elementary school with its proximity to Highland. I mean, it's very, very close to Highland. Does that have any implication, I guess, as far as redistricting, or is that typical? How does that kind of play out if you're looking at a map of the areas again? They're like on top of each other.
I think I have bring that up. I think I got the same. So this is the map we're looking at, same map that Renee brought up. So I believe Dodd's right in here, across right in this general area.
Yeah, I think it's right by that purple dot. You're right on.
Yeah, it's right off of here. So it's still on this western side here. So I mean, basically, you're almost kind of cutting this in half. From here up and over on this east side, where this would probably all go to Highland, and this you'd almost go east-west. If you're just looking at geographically from a map at a high level, that's where Malone comes into play to help us figure out those new lines, if you will. in that location that we're talking on Jarvis and Marion, that was where that middle school was, proposed, and it's actually here's that sketch from years ago, back in
From the
17.
previous.
This is Jarvis and Marion. This is kind of a sketch conceptual that we found.
Yeah, this is from the previous study in
So
2017.
it gives you some good flexibility, just, again, using that site as a potential. I don't know if it's still available, but if you can accommodate, a 6-8, which is in or 7-8, excuse me. That's the space standards. It's a little bit bigger. It's about 145,000 square feet. So yeah, a lot of good merits to that.
Chuck, it is still available. Town still owns it.
That's right. Okay, Tom. Excellent. Well, we got some good options, I think, with that, with those two different scenarios, and I like those.
Any other questions on the scenario stuff? Going once, put it in the chat because I can only see about 10 screens.
Yeah.
Everybody good? All right, Chuck, you want to move on to how this kind of ties into schedule, kind of where we're at as far as an update?
Let me come back to go down to schedule, and I appreciate all this input, because this is what we're hoping is to kind of spur this conversation and get feedback and different ideas, and these are great. So the overall project schedule, a little bit tough to read, but we're in our purple phase, our phase 2 developing scenarios. I think we're tracking well from where we wanted to be. I'm just going to go to our milestone. That was the detailed schedule for phase 2, and our goal of the committee selecting a preferred scenario of that January 20th date. I think we're looking pretty good. So we're here in November 2nd, review of the initial scenarios. The next meeting is November 18th, and we're going to have a couple meetings with the subcommittee to further develop these, working this option of the definitely the 7-8 middle school. And if anybody else comes up with another option, please forward them through Jen and Chuck so we can put them in the mix. Because we want to do a deeper dive on these options, and put these in and develop them a little bit further, and look at maybe some phasing and get some feedback on like the high school options and the schools that are in the outer years, if you will, is what we want to start developing, and then come back on the 18th, and hopefully on the 18th. I don't know if I want to say a decision, but hopefully get a feel good and a consensus from the committee that we have the scenarios that we want to look at and price up, vet it out. We can always add more later. So after that meeting, that's when we're going to start putting, doing deeper dives on these and the high level analysis and doing our budget ratios, doing our calculators for district shares, ultimately doing cash flows that we would share with Jim and get his input on what the impact to the overall town might be for these. And Jim, you'll get a month by month projection, cash flow projection, so you can get it by the month for all these projects. It might be 10 years, but it's a lot of detail that you would get for that. Depending on what happens on the 18th, if we're not fully there with all the options, what I wanted to throw out is the idea of possibly having a special meeting on December 2nd, so we can tweak those, because we have a couple weeks in between with the holiday, and I'd hate to lose time on our schedule. So I highlight that in yellow as a potential. If on the 18th, if you feel good collectively that yes, we have all the scenarios we want to look at, then we start doing the dive on the pricing and more phasing. But if not, maybe come back on the 2nd with any other further options that you want to take a look at, and then come back on the 7th to start looking at the draft budget ranges.
Got it.
Yeah, we can
So,
determine that then.
so you kind of touched on items C and D of the agenda there as far as the next steps would be refining these options you kind of presented, taking it to the next level. You're going to be meeting with the subcommittee led by Renee, includes Renee, Sylvia, and Andrew over the next week. And then by this next meeting on November 18th, have a deeper dive into these scenarios.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, definitely.
And
To the
then we
point
had,
where now we get Malone and McBroom. That's where, because in there, if you remember their proposal, they gave us a cost per scenario to develop and, redraw the district lines, give us new enrollment projections based upon these options. Specifically, the elementary schools now those are going to be really key. And so we want to use their time wisely in that budget.
got it. And we had one more follow-up question here, I think is relevant from David on the town council. Just looking for a general timeline from when something goes to referendum. How long is it from referendum approval to students actually being in the new building? I think it kind of summarized it there.
So depends on the size of the school, but just using, again, going to that, our South Windsor model, if you will. If we're doing a new elementary school, it's generally about 3 years from when we pass referendum, because a project, as far as the state of Connecticut is concerned, the project starts when you pass funding, whether in your case referendum. Some districts are representative, town meeting or town council. It's referendum because you cannot procure professional services and have them reimbursable until after the funding authorization for the project. And that's really important to know that like if we decide to hire an architect firm to do some of these scenarios and do a deeper dive on the selected option, those services aren't eligible for reimbursement if the referendum hasn't been passed. And we have to go back out for selection after referendum for architect services as well. You can't extend their contract. So the project starts when the funding starts. When we put the grant application in, all that does is affect when you get on the priority list and when you can start being reimbursed and submitting reimbursement requests. But generally for an elementary school, 3 to 4 years. We've been on a 3-year track with South Windsor. So we passed, for example, they passed referendum this past March for phase 3 for Pleasant Valley. We're scheduling to occupy fall of 2023. It's about 3.5 years there.
And just as a follow-up on that, a middle school, is that a significant, is there, like, for example, if you went to middle school, which obviously is almost twice the size, does that have a significant impact on the amount of time before that's occupiable?
Yeah, you'd have a couple months on the building construction. So for just as a point of comparison, David, our first project in South Windsor was 76,000 square feet. They constructed that building, the building itself, not the final product, the building itself to get occupied was 14 months, with the site taking another couple months over the summer. We try to get the new school completed so that we can move contents and move furniture in while the contractor is finishing the site. For a middle school, you're probably looking at a solid 18 to 20 months, depending on site conditions. I mean, that can vary if there's a lot of site work, obviously, but definitely will affect that for sure.
All right, because I just want to, obviously, when I'm looking at these elementary school numbers and how they're starting to potentially grow, obviously you want to make sure that whatever school is going to be built or renovated or whatever we do is going to have to be ready in time to handle that capacity increase. So just curious.
Correct. And when we do the scenarios, we also accompany it with a macro schedule, kind of like you've seen, really high level design, bidding, construction, occupancy, really at a high level for many reasons. One, so we can evaluate when it would be occupied and completed. And we would talk to some of our CM colleagues that we work with just to test the time frame, get an idea. We don't want to have something that's too long because that just expands the escalation costs, but you do too short and then the expectations are not realistic. So, and it also drives the escalation. We go to midpoint of construction, usually it's about 3.5%, compounded. so that we can accommodate that in that budget.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you, Chuck. Moving along, is everybody good? Colliers, thank you, Chuck, for the presentation. Thought it was very helpful, very clear. So we'll move on to Rich with an update from the communications subcommittee. Has been doing a lot of work.
Sure. I hope you've had an opportunity to take a look at the new Facebook page. It's up and running. We started to put material on there. Went through initially, we put some of the graphs on from Malone and McBroom. And we've also put on the slides from the staff teacher input committee and the slides from the school visitation committee. So there's some information there for people to see. And I know we've gotten a couple of people who have some feedback saying that they like the fact that there's some readily available material there. We haven't gone out and really pushed it yet. We were tweaking it and getting it up and running. And we also didn't want to be bumping into all the stuff that's out there regarding the election and all that. So come the next week, we'll start getting some things into the community forum, the education forum, some of the other places, and try to build the connections there. We had a really good meeting last week, and we did throw a bunch of ideas around that are still percolating a little bit. And we spoke with Jeff Solon about even using the Cheshire High School program, their marketing students to help us develop a marketing campaign. So we've got some things going there. I'm going to turn it over to Kate and Jeff because they can tell you a little bit more about some of the technology ideas and how we're going to start to roll some of that stuff out. So Kate or Jeff, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so we started with the Facebook page. We're day 6. We've had our Facebook page, and we really haven't shared it out on any of the community pages. And we already have 100 likes and over 100 followers. So I think that's the place where we're going to get the most traction is through Facebook. We have a Twitter page and Instagram as well, where we're posting the same information that's on the Facebook page. But we haven't shown any growth on either of those yet, but they're different audiences. So that's our next goal, is to target next week and start to push things out on those. And if all of you could like and follow our pages and share it with your followers, that would really help us gain a following. But I think people have really joined, even though we've only had a few comments on the site. We've had quite a few people who want to know what is going on. So I think that's why they're kind of following and waiting to see what we post. The other thing, next week, Arnett and I are going to meet and kind of go over our the website, the School Modernization Committee website, and maybe look at ways to make it a little bit more user-friendly. There's a lot of links to a lot of meetings, and we just want to make it so that if we're driving traffic to that page, which is going to hold all of our information, that we just make it more user-friendly for our users. I don't know if Jeff...
For anybody that might be watching, what's the name of the website, the Facebook website?
School Modernization Committee.
Cheshire School Modernization.
Cheshire School Modernization, okay.
And Twitter and Instagram is SMC Cheshire.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Kate. Jeff, did you have anything to add? Or
yeah,
Rich,
I just wanted
anything
to add, our overall objective is to take, this massive amounts of hours and hours of information and consolidate it in a format where, all of the different groups and people wanting to know what's going on can get kind of the Cliff Notes versions. So that's kind of the theme that we all put together. And then we will have links and attachments where they can roll back to get more detailed information if they like. And it also allows us to target the specific groups that we're trying to go after. It's not going to be a presidential election, so we're going to have, our work cut out for us getting everybody out there.
Very good. Is there any questions for the communications group? Questions? Good. Very good. I'll turn it back over to Jen. We're going to talk about the school tours.
Yes, thank you, Chuck. So we talked last time about the possibility of doing school tours. We have 4 schools left that the SMC has not been able to go through yet. So I've been speaking with Dr. Solon about how we can make that happen. So you can't see Dr. Solon, but if you're there, I know you have a survey, I believe, that you'd like to share with everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Jen.
There you are.
Yeah, basically, what I did with Vin is try and compile a list of dates and a quick survey on your interests in terms of which schools you'd like to see as priorities. Humiston, Darcy, Doolittle, and Norton are the 4 we have left. And so Arnett can send that survey out. If you could just take that as soon as you get a chance. We tried to squeeze in the opportunities prior to the next meeting, and I'll just send out a schedule of when those meetings are, when those options are.
And you're going to send out that schedule based on people's responses to the survey, right?
Correct. So the sooner people could respond to the survey, the easier it'll be for us to try and schedule some times. But we're going to add more than, just provide enough opportunities, let's say, to make sure we can get to each of them based on the survey feedback.
And we did decide that they're going to be in person, but we're going to be splitting up into smaller groups. Is that right?
Correct. So, based on, again, on the survey feedback, we can put people together and do small enough groups of tours. We tried to schedule it at times when there wouldn't be as many people in the building, students wise. Actually, I don't think there are really any students in the building at the times we scheduled it. So it should work out for everybody.
Great. So if everyone could respond to that as quickly as possible, that would be great, so we can get those on the calendar and get them completed before our next meeting. I'm really happy that we're going to be able to get that done. So thank you all for helping to do that. I know it's a lot of work, so thank you. Any questions on the school tours? Okay. Next item is report from BOE members. I know we lost Andrew and Tony's not here, and there you are. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so this should be fast and easy because we have not had a meeting since we last checked in with y'all. So there really is no report.
Nothing to report back. Awesome. Okay. Thank you. The next item is public comment. Arnett, is there anything?
There are no public comments on the emails.
Okay, thank you. So the next meeting is scheduled for November 18th at 7 p.m. We are going to go back to in person at that meeting. The reason we had this meeting virtually is because of the town council members with the SMC and the town council together. It was just too many people to do it at Highland. So we're going back to our regular SMC people and supporting staff and colliers, so it's a little more feasible to do that at Highland. So the next meeting we're planning on doing that in the cafeteria in Highland again. So that is November 18th at 7 p.m. I think that's it. I thank you all, the town councilors, for attending. I appreciate it. And with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Richard. Second. Tim, thank you. All in favor? Okay, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for the invitation.
Thank you.